it all starts with the idea. A few months ago, I sketched a little drawing on a piece of paper. And in this drawing was the idea of a large painting, my largest yet, with bold shapes, intense colors, and a powerful composition. In this video, I hope to take you through my process as I paint the biggest painting I've ever done. Hi, my name is Swan. I've been painting abstract art as a hobby for as long as I can remember, and lately I've been feeling the need to document my process. I usually paint very intuitively. I will come up with an idea, theorize the technique needed, and paint until I feel like it looks right. So far it has worked great, but a little more than a year ago I painted this piece. It's an abstraction of the view I had in my old apartment. It took me a long time, required sketches, technique studies, and overall I approached it with a lot more care than any other painting before. And it paid off. To this day, it is still one of my favorite paintings. But that's not very surprising. Who would have thought that the more effort and thought you put into something, the better the results? Well, investing this much thought into this specific piece led me to ponder about my own creative process. It might sound surprising, but I don't really know my own creative process that well. How does it work? Where does it come from? What is the meaning I find in it? Why do I even paint? I'm not going to attempt to try explaining how and why ideas happen. I'm not a philosopher nor a neuroscientist. All I know is that I prefer having an idea, a starting point, a direction, before I start laying paint on the canvas. However, for this specific project, the idea was only the start. The scale of it called for a more detailed sketch. In a way, an idea is always stuck in a nebulous cloud of imagination. Making a more complete drawing allows you to bring your idea down from this imprecise realm to the real world, where you need to have actual elements locked in, like composition, proportions, or color. I stayed quite faithful to the original sketch, opting for a deep dark red color palette with a contrasting gold line. I want this painting not only to have depth, but also to play on the idea of visual focus. The gradient of the background serves as a backdrop for overlapping lines and rectangles. The twist is that the rectangles in the front are going to have blurry edges, whereas the lines beneath are going to be really sharp and in focus. Okay, maybe it is a bit relevant to think about where we get ideas from. I am a strong believer that we don't just get ideas out of thin air. Inspiration comes from the references and knowledge that we have, and ideas are the results of an unconscious process where it's all torn apart and recombined by our mind to create what we call original ideas. For instance, the blurriness I was referring to earlier comes from how Mark Rothko painted his undefined shapes. The lines come from my love for Mondrian, Kandinsky, or Malevich. I'm even inspired by myself. Yes, I know, I'm very inspiring. I liked the background in my previous painting so much that I wanted to explore the same technique, but with a different color palette. Having precise inspiration also helps practically, because it gives you a reference to analyze. The colors, the technique, the composition, all of those elements can be taken into consideration when you're turning your idea to a reality. With a detailed concept in hand, a simple yet very challenging question appeared. How do I paint this? Thanks to the earlier thought process, I was able to elaborate a shopping list, so I could once more indulge into my lifelong addiction to shopping for art supplies. I picked a large linen canvas with some high-quality acrylics, because I wanted to experience the good stuff, because I deserved to experience the good stuff. And I can confirm it was good stuff. With all my paints, my canvas, my tools, and other bits and bobs, I could finally begin the painting. Right? Wrong. With big ideas often come big prices. Overall, I spent 200 euros on this project, and I didn't want to waste any of the precious materials I had because of some mistake I could have seen coming. Foreshadowing. So I decided to dedicate a significant amount of time doing technical studies, because I needed very specific answers to very technical questions. For example, I'm using a palette knife to create the background gradient. This leaves small visible holes, so I need an underpainting. What color should it be? Then, I'm painting straight lines with masking tape, which creates a strong demarcation on the outline. Will it be visible under the rectangles? Similarly, the background will be textured. Will it be visible if I don't paint it under the rectangles? More importantly, is the gold line going to look good? And on the topic of looking good, I plan on painting the red rectangles using many layers of diluted paint to create imprecise, blurry edges. Is that going to look good? I decided to paint 4 different studies to try out different answers to these questions.
Non, non, non. Kss, kss. Arrête de boire l'eau que je vais utiliser pour diluer la peinture.
I could have tested quickly on some paper, but I thought treating each study as its own mini painting was good practice for the main painting. I find it quite reassuring to have already done the particular gestures a couple of times before doing it the one time that really matters. And if you think about it, it's a piece of advice that applies to many parts of life.
I should start a self-improvement course. I bet I'd make money with that.
The other good thing that comes with practicing the physical realization of the idea is a plan of action. I'll explain the details once we get to the main painting, but I now knew precisely, step by step, how to paint it. First, a dark yet vibrant red underpainting, followed by a background with holes where the rectangles would go. Then the lines, interrupted when they go under a rectangle. Then a layer of paint, applied with a palette knife to replicate the same texture than the background under the foreground rectangles. And finally, the red rectangles using many layers of diluted paint. Easy. The more time you spend thinking, planning, and preparing, the harder it is to actually start doing it. At least, it's what I have experienced with every personal project I've overtaken. Call it perfectionism or lack of confidence or procrastination, or all of the above. Probably all of the above. To elaborate on the specific technique I developed for the background, I used a palette knife to apply different shades of black to dark red and red oxide. This technique creates a lovely texture that I always find very interesting to look at. It feels like there is always a new detail to discover. The sheer scale of the painting made this step very challenging. It took a lot of zooming out to figure out where to add a brighter or darker shade, or where it looked too simple, too obvious. It really was a trust the process moment, and it took a while before I was confident that it was going to look as good as I intended. I ended up being very happy with the result. My cat, however, was very unimpressed. Respecting the proportions and measurements of my sketch was also a challenge. It took a lot of careful measuring and preparing marks with masking tape to make sure every single line was in the right place. By the way, making straight lines with masking tape is quite nerve-wracking. It needs to be perfect, otherwise it misses the mark of that geometric preciseness. In this case, I used matte medium, which is an uncolored acrylic that dries transparent, to seal the gap
between the train and the platform.
Between the canvas and the tape and prevent any paint to leak and make messy smudges around the edges. Theoretically and empirically, it works, and it should have given me flawless line after the process. But then I removed the tape. One could argue that the most discouraging part of creation is the friction between idea and reality. One should always consider that something can and usually will go wrong. In the case of this project, the culprit was the matte medium. I used it to protect the painting below the tape, but it leaked and left very visible smudges. It wasn't the type of fatal mistake that brings an entire project down. However, it was enough to stop me in my progress, and it left me a bit unclear about how to best handle the situation. Both the technical and financial scale of this painting forced me to approach the situation almost scientifically. I recreated the problem several times and thought of 5 different solutions to compare to a control test. Scraping the smudges with paint thinner, applying a pre-layer of varnish on the smudges, covering the smudges with 2 different acrylic primers, and the most drastic, time-consuming and dreaded solution, painting over the smudges. My assistant thoroughly inspected my working station before I could get to it. I knew I would be varnishing the piece, so the solution I was looking for was the one that would make the smudges the least noticeable once the finishing varnish was applied. This was a tedious process, with no certainty that any solution was going to be satisfactory. Which is an excellent game, by the way. I am trying to paint something that I've never painted before, for which I have no model to reproduce. In this type of situation, problem solving is part of the creative process as much as ideation or preparation. I would even say that it is the crucial step in which the conflict between concept and object is resolved and the idea truly becomes real. Fortunately, for this specific problem in this specific piece, there was a solution, which was to apply GAC 100, GAC 100? JAC? Which is a semi-glossy acrylic primer to counteract the matteness of the smudges before the final varnish evens out the overall glossiness of the piece. I was immensely relieved, and I could finish the piece. While I was applying my newly found solution to the painting, a question came to mind. Why do I care if the lines are perfect or not? Why did I spend tens of hours trying to perfect the technique to paint undefined, abstract, and inherently meaningless geometrical shapes? A question indeed. Allow me to introduce my very personal and not so refined opinion about abstract art. Any object that is represented carries meaning by itself. When you paint, let's say, a hand, it is a hand, no matter how you paint it. So the painting you do will already carry the meaning of a hand before you can add any other meaning through color, technique, or composition. Representative painting will always have that baseline meaning of what is being represented. On the other hand, abstract art, defined as the absence of representation, carries no underlying meaning because it represents nothing. A square, a color, a gradient, or a smudge, they aren't inherently meaningful, but that doesn't mean abstract art has no meaning. In the compositions, the colors, the techniques, there often are symbols, emotions, movements that are shaped by the way the meaningless is brought to reality. And I would argue that the true meaning of abstract art lies not in the subject, but in the technique, not in the what, but in the how. And that's why the perfection of the technique was so important to me. Anyway, that was my oversimplification of abstract art. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk. Back to the painting, I was now in the finish line. I first recreated the texture of the background with inexpensive paint in the spaces where the rectangles would go. I briefly mentioned it during the studies, but this step serves two purposes. Reducing the cost of the painting, because I didn't want to use my expensive paints where it would be covered by something else, and covering the lines with volume so it looks like they disappear under the rectangles once they're painted. I then prepared 4 shades of diluted acrylic washes that I would layer on top of each other to give depth to my rectangles, similar to what Mark Rothko probably did on his own paintings. It felt weird when I started to paint the rectangles. It was the last step. Usually when I paint something, I'm always asking myself what more to add, what to change. But at that moment, I knew this was final. I knew for sure that I was watching the idea become reality before my eyes. Well, I still had to sign and varnish it, but aside from that, it was actually done. At the beginning of this video, I mentioned the process started a few months ago. Specifically, it was in April 2025. As of recording this, we're in late October of that same year, and I just finished applying the varnish to the painting. For months, it just sat in my bedroom, leaning against a wall in a plastic bag. I even got a haircut during all that time. At the start of this journey, I thought my creation could exist for itself, but as soon as I was nearly done, I felt demoralized, that it had no context, no purpose, no place to be. The original plan was to sell the painting, but at the time it felt too great of an obstacle to overcome, and I didn't really believe that someone could find my art interesting enough. But one day, a colleague to which I had mentioned the project before asked me about it, and when I showed her the finished piece, she loved it. She even asked me if I was willing to sell it to her. I was absolutely thrilled. It gave me a reason to finish the painting. And not only did I finish it, I also rewrote the entire script for the video, and I am currently filming the last footage. Okay, I know I'm stalling, but before I show you the beauty shots, I really wanted to share this final lesson I learned. I don't think we create in a vacuum. I think every creation requires a context, a purpose. The thrill of novelty motivated me to start the painting, but it was the knowledge that it would find a place to be that really helped me finish it. Throughout this journey, perhaps the most important thing I learned about my creative process is that I need to know I'm creating for something, someone, or somewhere that will appreciate my work. And I'm sure that many creative people out there have very different motivations. But for me personally, this is what makes me finish what I start. This is what turns concept into object. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, feel free to interact with it in any way you want. I'm not a YouTuber, but I'll probably make more videos about stuff I make, or post earlier creations, so you might want to stick around. Have a good rest of your day, and I'll see you around.